FAS, free alongside ship, Incoterms 2020 rules updated. Historically, FAS, free alongside ship, had its origins in the days of sailing ships, whereby the seller would place his goods, alongside a vessel nominated by the buyer. A brief introduction to free alongside ship, FAS. FAS is not commonly used these days, but it may still be used in shipments of heavy machinery, brought to the pier or barge alongside the ship, in both cases to be loaded on board the vessel designated by the buyer. Goods are not transferred until the vessel is adjacent to the port, where the goods are to be shipped. The seller must complete export procedures, and the buyer must complete import procedures. Since the buyer contracts for carriage, the shipper on the bill of lading should be the buyer and not the seller. It is most likely that the seller will require a mate's receipt, or some other form of export documentation, such as a copy of the bill of lading for VAT and GST. Free alongside ship Incoterms 2020 rule, what's changed and what's new. Initially published in 1936, the term has origins that date probably back to the days of sailing ships. The first version did not cover export procedures. However, the seller was required by the rules of 1953, to assist the buyer in getting an export license. In Incoterms 1900, the responsibility for export formalities remained with the buyer, but in Incoterms 2000, it went to the seller. Since FAS has its origins on the quay side or a barge at the vessel's side, it can only be used where goods are placed beside a vessel. In addition, the FAS terms cannot be used to ship containers, whether FCL or LCL, because the seller provides the goods to the carrier at an inland point, such as a container freight station, CFS for LCL consolidations, or container yard, CY. Free alongside ship, seller and buyer obligations, costs, and risks. FAS, A1B1 General Obligations. A1 General Obligations, Seller. Each of the 11 rules requires the seller to provide the goods, their commercial invoices, and any other evidence of conformity that might be needed. This could include an analysis certificate, or weighing machine document, etc. Every rule also stipulates that any particular document may be in writing or electronic form depending on what the parties agree to or customary, based on the contract terms. There is no specific definition of electronic form. It could be anything from a PDF file to blockchain or even something completely new. B1 General Obligations, Buyer. Each of the rules requires that the buyer pay the price, determined by the sale contract. The rules do not specify by whom or when the payment should be made, prepayment, by letter of credit, or any other method, or how or when the payment should be made, before shipment, after shipment, 30 days after shipment, 50% advance, or any other method. The contract should specify these matters. FAS, A2B2, Delivery. A2 Delivery, Seller. The seller's responsibility is to place the goods alongside the vessel, provided by the buyer on the date agreed, or within the agreed term notified from the buyer, or, if no time was specified, then at the end of that period. The delivery method will vary according to the nature of the goods, and the customs at the port. For example, goods may be, say, rolls of aluminum sheet, in which case they will likely have outer wrapping and strapping, slabs of granite strapped to pallets, logs of timber, machinery, or some other kind of large or complex product. Depending on where they are, they might be sitting on the quay, or barged downriver. The most crucial part is that the vessel has to be present, to be able to be alongside. Under FAS rules, placing the goods before any vessel berths on a quay, is not a delivery. B2 Delivery, Buyer. The buyer must take delivery when the goods have been delivered, as described in the A2 article on delivery. FAS, A3B3, Transfer of Risk. A3 Transfer of Risk, Seller. Seller is solely responsible for all loss and damage to the goods until the goods are delivered, under paragraph A2 of this article on delivery. There is, however, an exception in B3 below, which describes loss or damage in certain circumstances. B3 Transfer of risk, buyer. Once the seller delivers the goods described in Article A2 on delivery, the buyer is solely responsible for loss or damage to the goods. If the seller was not made aware of where and when the vessel would be presented, or if the vessel is unable to deliver or refuses to take the goods, so that the seller cannot deliver, the buyer is responsible for any losses or damages after the agreed date or period. FAS, A4B4, carriage. A4 carriage, seller. The seller is not obligated to arrange for carriage. However, at the buyer's request, the seller is obligated to provide the buyer with any known information, including security requirements, and transport information the buyer requires to arrange carriage, at the buyer's risk and cost. The seller may contract for carriage on usual terms, typically specified in the contract or determined based on previous transactions between the parties, at the buyer's risk and expense. During the delivery process, the seller must meet any transport-related security requirements. B4 carriage, buyer. Unless otherwise stated in the A4 article on carriage by the seller, the buyer must arrange at its own expense for the carriage of the goods from the named port of shipment. FAS, A5B5, insurance. A5 insurance, seller. There is no risk for the seller beyond the point of delivery, so an insurance contract is not necessary. However, at the buyer's expense and risk, the seller must provide information, in its possession to the buyer, needed to arrange its insurance. B5 insurance, buyer. The buyer does not have to insure the goods, even if the goods are at risk from the delivery point. It is entirely up to the buyer whether to insure the goods or bear the risk themselves. FAS, A6B6, delivery or transport document. A6 delivery or transport document, seller. The seller's responsibility is to provide the buyer, at their expense with usual proof of delivery of the goods under the A2 article. Contracts of sale will determine the consideration arrangement, based on nature and manner in which goods are placed on quays, and brought to vessels. In the absence of a transport document, the seller must assist the buyer in obtaining a transport document at the buyer's expense. B6 delivery or transport document, buyer. The buyer must accept proof of delivery provided by the seller. FAS, A7B7, export and import clearance. A7 export and import clearance, seller. Like the rest of the multimodal rules, this one is suitable for both domestic and international transactions. It is the seller's responsibility to complete all export clearance procedures, at its own expense, necessary for the country of export, such as licenses or permits, export security clearance, pre-shipment inspections, and any other approvals or authorizations. The seller is not obligated to arrange transit clearance or import clearance. However, upon request from the buyer, the seller must assist the buyer in acquiring any documents and information it needs to comply with the formalities required by the country of transit or import, such as permits, licenses, customs clearance, inspections, and approvals. B7 export and import clearance, buyer. Buyers must assist sellers where required during all export-related formalities required by their export countries. They must do so at the seller's request, risk, and expense. The buyer is responsible for completing and paying for any formalities required by transit countries and import countries. Among these are licenses and permits necessary for transit, import licenses and permits for importation, import clearance, security clearance for transit and importation, pre-shipment inspection, and any other authorizations and approvals. Since they occur after the seller has delivered the goods, they are the buyer's responsibility. It may seem strange to both the seller and buyer to bear responsibility for pre-shipment inspections. However, the seller is responsible for export requirements, whereas the buyer is responsible for the transit and import country requirements. FAS, A8B8, checking, packaging, marking. A8 checking, packaging, marking, seller. Generally, the seller is liable to cover all costs incurred for the delivery of the goods, including inspection, measuring, weighing, and counting the goods and packaging. Sellers also must package their goods at their costs, unless it is customary for these goods to be sold unpackaged, such as bulk goods. Additionally, the seller must package the goods appropriately, to allow for transport unless expressly stated in their contract that the goods must be packaged or marked in a particular way. B8 Checking, packaging, marking, buyer. As a general rule, the buyer has no obligation to the seller regarding packaging and marking. Although in practice, there can be exceptions, for instance, when the buyer provides labels, logos, etc., to the seller. FAS, A9B9, Allocation of Costs. A9 Allocation of Costs, Seller. As described in A2 on delivery, the seller is responsible for all costs up to delivery, which is alongside the vessel for FAS terms. Except for those, the buyer must pay according to B9. If the contract between the parties stipulates that a bill of lading will prove that the goods have been delivered, the seller will bear the document fee. The seller is responsible for paying any export clearance costs, taxes, and duties. If the seller requests information or documents from the buyer to assist them in their export formalities, they must reimburse the buyer for those costs. B9 Allocation of Costs, Buyer. The buyer must pay all costs related to the goods, after they have been delivered, unless the seller has paid them under A9. The buyer must reimburse the seller for any costs and charges related to assistance in obtaining and providing documents, relating to transportation and insurance, delivery and transportation documents, and export or import clearance. Additionally, the buyer is responsible for reimbursing the seller for transit and import clearance duties and taxes. When the goods have been identified as contract goods, the buyer has failed to give notice under B10, or the nominated vessel fails to arrive on time, fails to take the goods, or closes earlier than the time notified. FAS, A10B10, Notices. A10 Notices, Seller. The seller must notify the buyer either after delivering the goods alongside the buyer's vessel or after the vessel failed to take delivery, after the goods had been made available. This might happen, for example, when the vessel departs without loading the goods from the quay or the barge. The rule does not mention any specific requirements for the buyer's vessel to fulfill when delivering the goods and loading them onto their vessel. However, it would be logical to include any specific requirements in the seller's notice. In most cases, this information would be included in the sale contract between two parties. B10 Notices, Buyer. When a buyer has security requirements relating to transportation and the vessel's name and loading point within the loading port, he should inform the seller promptly. These are usually spelled out in the contract. Recap. The seller's responsibility is to ensure the goods are properly exported, from when the goods are in the port, to the time they are alongside the ship. The risk passes to the buyer once the vessel is alongside. It is the buyer's responsibility to load and ship the cargo to its final location. Thank you for watching, and I hope the information provided in this video gives you a better understanding of the Incoterms rule for FAS. Do drop me your comments and let me know your thoughts. Coming soon, FOB, free on board. To be the first to watch the next video, please subscribe to my channel and click on the notification bell. Goodbye. From your trusted shipping guide. Revisit.